Psalm 13. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I store up anxious concerns within me, agony in my mind every day? How long will my enemy dominate me? Consider me and answer, Lord my God. Restore brightness to my eyes, otherwise I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have triumphed over him, and my foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your deliverance. I will sing to the Lord because he has treated me generously. This is the word of the Lord.
So good morning again. As I said a few moments ago, my name is Joel. So I've had a few weeks of a preaching break. You might have noticed. We mentioned that it was actually supposed to be a little bit longer. And the reason we do that normally every summer is just so that I have some time and energy to focus into other things that we have going on as a body. We had some things shift around, so I'm back here the next couple of weeks. So and just back in the rhythm. So I am grateful to see y'all. I missed your faces last week. I heard it was a good time at First Missionary Baptist. I'm glad. That was one of the reasons we added a second date, actually, because when we had to move it, I was going to be out of town, and I was like, well, selfishly, I want to be there. So we added another date. It was good to see y'all. We were out of town this last weekend with some of my side of the family, spending a few days at the beach, which was awesome for the most part, restful and enjoyable. Now the drive there, not so much. If you've ever taken a trip with young kids, especially headed somewhere that they're excited about and they have anticipation, you know what you're going to hear over and over and over, right? Either are we there yet, or what my kids love to say is how much longer, how much longer? And so thankfully now in the age of GPS, I just tell them, hey, look, it's right here. You can see it on Google Maps. It's telling you how much longer. And so just look at it. But I do get where they're coming from. I look at the GPS often as well. I want to know how long every drive I take is going to be. Even if I'm going to a place across town, I'm like still putting it in. Because I'm like, is it going to be 12 minutes, 15 minutes, 16 minutes? I need to know. And then, of course, it's a game. I'm trying to see if I can beat what Google Maps tells me I'm going to get there, which I did not this last trip. It was supposed to be like 4 hours. It ended up being like 6 hours. And that was a little bit miserable, but anyways, so kids, right? How much longer? And it's one thing to ask how much longer when we're talking about, driving in a car headed to the beach, but most of us can relate to the cry of how much longer when we're facing something in life that's much more serious. Whether we might find ourselves in the midst of suffering, in the midst of ongoing sickness, maybe relational stress, maybe emotional turmoil, or any other number of things that might keep us up at night, we often want to know, how long is this going to last? How much longer will this anxiety and depression strangle me? How much longer is this relationship going to be strained? How much longer will this grief cripple me after I've suffered loss? And even though we don't have a GPS in those moments to give us exact answers to our cries of how long, what we do have in Psalm chapter 13 is maybe something better, and that is a roadmap for our soul. Not necessarily to give us what we want, which is all of the answers, but instead to give us what we need, which is eyes that are lifted up to a faithful God who does have all the answers, and who has promised to save and deliver, and not only that, but to generously give us abundant life. And that's what we're looking at this morning. As you can see, we're continuing through our Summer in the Psalms series. We do this not every summer, but a lot of summers where we just take time to spend some time looking at individual Psalms and preaching through them. As you've already heard, just by way of reminder, remember the Psalms is the prayer book for God's people. They are full of songs and poems and prayers, and it really does capture the entire spectrum of emotions that exist in the hearts of humans. Wherever you might find yourself this morning, there is a psalm that speaks to where you are at. Great joy, deep depression, abundant provision and dire need, exuberant praise and sorrowful lament. They're all there. Psalm 13 is an individual lament from the pen of David. A lament simply is a song or a prayer that expresses grief, sorrow, and often great confusion. A lot of questions. There are some laments that we find in the Psalms that surround a very specific time in David's life. We know that either by the heading or by hints that he gives us in the Psalm, but this one is intentionally broad. We don't know why he's in turmoil. We don't know why he's in stress. There's no confession of sin. There's no talking about a specific enemy he's facing. It's a short, simple prayer. And I think the point of this intentionally broad lament is to help us see how the situation is dealt with more than what the situation actually is. That no matter where we're at, times of deep sorrow and grief, that in those we might find a roadmap for our conversations with God as we walk through those times. And in the end, as always, it ultimately points us to Christ. So the psalm this morning can be broken down simply into three movements. We'll use them as kind of our three main themes this morning, our framework. Verses 1 through 2 is an honest repining of heartache. I was really stretching for that R, but it worked. Verses 3 through 4 is an honest request for help. And verses 5 through 6 is an honest refrain of hope. So it's a very simple poem. And so we're going to start by looking at the first movement of the poem, which is this, an honest repining of heartache. To repine is simply to express sadness, and often it's the idea of complaining about something, especially in a bad situation. And David has no problem complaining out loud to God. This is honest, transparent, raw, and real. And I love that David takes this to God. Unfortunately, many Christians have been taught that God wants a smiling face over honest discontent, as if somehow you could trick God into not knowing where you're really at anyways. But often that's how we do it. We have incredible freedom as God's children to go to him with every single care and anxiety. And God is not intimidated or scared by it at all. And David understands this. He cries out 4 times, how long, how long, how long, how long? He has no problem with sharing out loud to God his heartache. And not only that, but penning it in a lament that others might see and hear as well. The first 2 cries of how long are directed at Yahweh himself. It's how he really feels. He starts with his frustrations with God. Look at how he expresses this upward facing turmoil in verse 1. He says, how long, Lord, will you forget me forever? Again, we don't know exactly what kind of suffering David is facing, but we do know that in the suffering, how he feels is that he feels alone, forgotten, and abandoned. This is the reality. It's where he actually feels. He feels like God is passively uninterested in his plight, as if God's calendar got too busy and he didn't realize how much time had gone by since he last checked in on David to grab lunch and ask him how he was doing. It's bad enough that he accuses God of forgetting him, but then he almost mocks him by saying, is this going to be forever? Like that's what it feels like to David in this moment of suffering. And we all know the phrase, time flies when you're having fun. And it might fly when you're having fun, but when you're in the midst of suffering, if you've been there, you know that every single second drags on for what feels like eternity. And this is where David is. It feels like he is alone, like God has abandoned him, and like it's going to last forever. So he continues sharing this heartache in the rest of verse 1. The accusations against God get even worse. The second how long, he says, how long will you hide your face from me? So the first accusation was that God passively just maybe got busy and forgot him. But this line of the lament accuses God of actively avoiding him, of hiding his face from David. And this is a place that if we've lived long enough in life, and if we're willing to be honest with our souls, we've all probably been here with God. Now again, us Christians who've been taught to put on the face and don't really tell God when we're upset at him, we might not say it out loud like David. We might not put it in our journal because it scares us. But if we search ourselves, we're often angry at God in the midst of trials. Now, because we've been taught we're not allowed to say the honest things out loud, right? We normally skip verse 1 and we jump right to blaming ourselves or others, which is what David's going to do in just a moment. But normally, even our blame for ourselves and our blame against others is a mask for our frustration with God. God, why did you, if we really get down to the bottom of it, why did you let me go through that situation as a kid? How did you see me there and ignore me and not do something, God? Right now, how much longer are you going to ignore my cries for healing? When are you going to do something about my situation? When are you going to move? How long? When are you going to act? And we feel alone. In moments of deep suffering, it is not uncommon for Christians or any human to feel very alone. And that's not a fun feeling. And here's the thing, we're not crazy for feeling that way. Like the reality is, often in times of grief, loss, pain, or suffering, we actually are more alone than we were before with other humans. The reality is you've been there where you don't know what to say. You're like, should I reach out? I don't really know what's going on. Like I want to ask, or maybe you get so busy because you have your own mess and you're like, oh my gosh, like you think about reaching out, but you don't, and you look up and you go to text them and you realize it's been 6 months since you last reached out. Like the reality is when people walk through hard times, a lot of times they are more alone. But here's what we end up doing. We take that view and those human characteristics and we begin to attribute them to God. And that is exactly what David is doing in this psalm. It's so interesting, the accusations he has against God. In the cultural context, in the Hebrew tradition, God's people were told from the very beginning over and over and over, don't forget God's covenant love. Remember, don't forget, but they often forgot. And David knew that pattern. And so here in David's lament, there's this inversion of that call to not forget. And here he bluntly accuses God of being the one to forget his covenant love. This language of God hiding his face is introduced all the way back in Genesis when Cain has to hide his face from God's presence because he's murdered his brother. And the language of hiding his face is introduced. And here in another inversion, David attributes that action of hiding his face to God. See, the tendency is for us to assume and project onto God how humans respond in suffering. Other humans flee when times get hard. We've seen it, we've lived it. Why wouldn't God? Other humans haven't known how to talk to me, haven't been able to put up with me. Why would God? Other humans break their promises when things get hard. Other humans let, months go by without checking in. Why wouldn't God? And so we've put God in that box. David has put God in that box. And we really actually believe and feel that not only is he silent, but he's intentionally avoiding us because we're too hard for him. We don't want to hear from him. And so we naturally turn into our own thoughts. And this is what happens with David in verse 2. He says, how long will I store up anxious concerns within me, agony in my mind every day? He moves from lamenting the upward turmoil to the inward turmoil in his own soul. He's honest about this. The word translated concerns here is almost always translated counsel in other passages. And the idea here is that in the mind of David, since God has gone silent, he only has his own counsel and wisdom to rely on. And so he turns inward, trying to figure out what's going on. But because he's not all-knowing, because he is not God, it just turns to anxious counsel in his own soul. It causes agony in his mind, or that word is also translated heart later in this passage. We don't want to talk to God. He might actually answer us. And so we've already put him in a box. And so instead we try to help ourselves, which there's nothing wrong with speaking truth to yourself out loud. But here's my problem. Like recently I read a sports psychology book and it was all about talking to yourself, which again, maybe can be helpful. But here's my problem. What about when I don't even believe what I'm saying out loud to actually be true? Like if I'm saying, I know God is all good and he's never let me down, but I don't even believe it. How does it help me in those moments? All it does is lead to more anxiety and agony. And we've been there when our thoughts are running at night, keeping us up, and we're rehearsing over and over, trying to figure out a way of our messes, or we're just sitting in anxiety, going through all the scenarios in our mind of what could or couldn't happen, wondering when the suffering might finally subside, whether it's big, like high level suffering, or low level, and just small little things that nag away at our soul. And then this inward turmoil often gives way to outward turmoil, which is when we begin looking around us and saying, that's where the problem is. And that's the last how long David expresses. And again, like this is good. Like honesty is good. Look at the rest of verse 2. He says, how long will my enemy dominate me? Now there's no doubt that this was a real cry. David had real enemies. And so do we. Like they might not like look exactly like David where he's got like Saul chasing him on the run, but like we have real enemies. But here's what David is really expressing here. It's why he uses the language of dominate. This is not just that he's losing. It is like he is being humiliated. This is actually a very good translation choice here. What he is really expressing at the root of this loss and being dominated by his enemy is this deep shame that he feels. This is David, the king who's gone into the temple and sang the praises of God as a deliverer. He's expressed that God protects his people. But now in this lowest low, facing oppression and domination from his enemies, instead of joy and confidence in God the deliverer, he feels incredible shame. This word dominate is a rising up over someone. It's like foot on the neck. It is why none of us like to lose, because it proves what we already believe, that we're a bunch of nobodies. And for David, this is just the cherry on top. God's gone and forsaken me. My own thoughts trouble me. I don't have the answers. I'm full of anxiety and anguish. And to top it all off, I'm a loser, humiliated by my enemies. And here's the thing. Even if David's enemies were gone, even if that one piece was solved, it still doesn't deal with the problem in his soul. It still doesn't fix his view about God and himself. This is a holistic problem, upward, inward, and outward, and it's a mess. How long? David has no problem expressing the reality of how he feels to God, which is the pathway to what comes next and one that we often skip over. But his honest opining of heartache eventually gives way to the second thing we'll see, which is an honest request for help. Even in the request of how long, we get a hint that David has a sliver of hope. Because the question of how long does ask when, not if. See, even though David is mad at God, you can kind of see him, it's like if you're, I don't know, mine normally is like screaming in the car or something, and then I kind of settle down a little bit, right? He's still angry, he's settling down, but he's moving from that expression of anger to an expression of dependence. He needs help. When suffering hits, when life is hard, when grief and loss fill our eyes with tears, so often we get so concerned with trying to handle it the right way and say the right things and make sure we're just really going through suffering well. But the question is not how we handle suffering, but where do we turn in the middle of it? And here's the thing, church, it won't be pretty. Your prayers in the middle of suffering will not be theologically accurate, and quit trying to make them so. Just be honest. You're gonna believe things about God that are not true. Say them out loud. God can handle it. So get it out. Your tears and cries and screams of anger might even make other Christians uncomfortable. That's okay. Get it out and tell God what you want. David here makes very specific requests and even gives the reasons why. Look at verses 3 and 4. This is what he moves to. He says, consider me an answer, Lord my God. I need you to restore brightness or light to my eyes. Otherwise, I've got motivations here. If not, I will sleep in death. Also, that enemy that's dominated me, they will say, I have triumphed over him, and my foes will rejoice because I am shaken. He asked God for three things to consider, which is the word look. To look and see. Do not hide your face from me. See the situation. But not only that, answer me. Let me know that you see me, and I need to also know that you're there. I need you to be close enough to me that I can hear your voice in the midst of this situation. Please, God, speak. And not only that, but do something about it. Don't just sit there. Take action. Bring light to my eyes. I'm still a little bit angry at you, God, but I know you're the only one that can do something. So will you please help? He asked God to bring light to the midst of this darkness and despair. He's drawing on the story of God at creation when he brought light from darkness. Also God's people in the wilderness as he led them with the pillar of fire. This is the same language All he can see is darkness and death. And he says, God, I need you because right now I can't see anything. I've eaten the bread of anxious toil. I've drank my tears of sorrow. I've stayed up all night trying to think of ways to fix the mess, and I can't. And so even in this moment, if David's heart is struggling to believe what God says is true about him, even if he's struggling to believe, he's heard the story of Hagar. He knows that God is a God of seeing. He knows the story of the people of Israel, that God has acted in the past when he delivered his people from Egypt out of slavery on dry ground. And even though right now he feels blind to it, all he says is, God, you gotta show up or I'm done for. If you don't show up, then death awaits, my enemies will defeat me, and my dignity will be stripped away. My enemies will rejoice over me as they watch my demise. And implied in this is also that they will mock Yahweh in the process, because that's supposed to be David's God. These are David's clear asks. And we can learn from this to make our own clear asks. Ask God what you need and what you want. Say it out loud. Say it clearly. It's okay. And if you're willing, you might even say why you want it, which is the part a lot of times we don't say out loud because it might reveal our own selfishness. But it's important to go there. Make the clear ask. Tell God what you need, and you might just find that God is actually present, that he does really see and he will actually speak to you. That's not just a promise for Old Testament saints, church. We have the very Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead within us, and he is still present with us and speaks to us in the darkness, just like he did to David here. See, this psalm begins with David in deep complaining, deep frustration, and it ends with incredible praise. But David doesn't move from complaining to praising by just white knuckling it, by talking to himself enough, by reading more, by trying to fix the situation. He moves from lament to praise by giving up, surrendering, and full dependence on the grace of God alone. And by this grace alone, as David is raw and honest and he requests for help, eventually this gives way to an honest refrain of hope. And that is how this poem ends. Look at how David finishes this. He says, but I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your deliverance. I will sing to the Lord because he has treated me generously. Now here's the thing. I don't believe these lines are fake. I believe that this is actually how David felt. And I believe that because David didn't have any problem telling us how he felt a few lines before, when it wasn't theologically perfect. It wasn't theologically accurate. But somehow, by grace alone, David moves from doubt to confidence, from lament to praise, from ashes to beauty, from tears to joy. And it's because his faith wasn't just in some fairy tale, some sweet by and by, some cliche to just get you through another night, like everything's gonna be all right. Is it? He needed faith in something real, something secure. And the object of David's faith, the thing that he trusted in, was God's faithful love. This is the Hebrew word, hesed. I have it tattooed on my arm in Hebrew, along with many other symbols of God's covenant love. Because the idea of this is that this is a love that no matter where your emotions are, no matter what it feels like, no matter what your heart might believe, no matter what your mind might think, that love is never ending, never failing, never giving up type of love. It's real, it's steady through the messes, through the suffering, through the anger. Unlike human love, it will never leave because it's covenant. It is tied to the very character of God. And so the forever that David felt in his suffering was nothing compared to the reality of forever that is God's hesed love. And this is what his heart trusted in. And the object of his trust begins to change him. It wasn't the amount of his trust. You can see David just barely hanging on here. One commentator points out that this could be translated, since I have trusted in your faithful love, my heart will rejoice. What changes him to rejoicing is not that his circumstances got fixed. It was that he saw the love of God. He believes that deliverance and salvation is coming, even if it hasn't happened yet. And in seeing the love of God, he's reminded of God's goodness. He says, you have treated me generously. This is the same God he was just accusing of forgetting him and turning his face against him. This language of treating generously is so interesting. It's actually the word that's almost always translated weaning. When a child was weaned, and the idea there is that God has weaned David in the sense that he has given him every single thing he needs. He has given him provision and abundance. As holistic as David's suffering has been, he doesn't minimize it, he's honest about it, but his deliverance will be even greater and abundant and generous. And we see things begin to shift. Instead of his enemies rejoicing over his demise, he doesn't care anymore about that because he's rejoicing over his deliverance. The same heart that had agony now rejoices. This is real and tangible, even if he doesn't fully see it in the moment. And he sings because he now has real hope. Like Paul and Silas in a prison cell. They weren't singing because they were trying to annoy the guards, though it might have. Like they actually had joy in their hearts. And here too, David's tears have given way to praise because he has found confidence, not in himself, not because he laid awake at night and tried to figure it. And he's like, okay, now I got a good plan. I went and got a roadmap for my success. No, because he gave up and he's found confidence in the love of God. Like a content and weaned child, he trusts his good father for provision and salvation. And as we read this psalm today, we might not be there, and that's okay. Be honest. This is a snapshot that we get in like a few stanzas that could have been days and years for David. We might still be in the how long stage of this prayer. And it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be our own sin. It could be the oppression of others and wondering if God is actually a God of justice. Does he see it? Could be grief, loss, big, small. Could be shame of your past failures. But just as real as David's hope was, so too is there a hope that is available to us beyond what the eye can see. See, ultimately this psalm is pointing us to Jesus, who is the ultimate answer for every cry of how long that we've ever prayed. The prophet Isaiah, he begins to explore this day that's coming. In chapter 35 and 51, he speaks of a day when God's people will gather to this eternal dwelling place. And it says there's gonna be song and we're all gonna be crowned with eternal joy and that gladness will overtake them and sorrow and sighing will flee. And that is the hope. Like, so no matter what it feels like right now, regardless of what your emotions are revealing that you actually believe, I want you to receive God's counsel instead of your own. Look what God has to say. Isaiah 49. Zion says, this is what we say, the Lord has abandoned me. The Lord has forgotten me. This was what David was saying. This is God's response. Can a woman forget her nursing child or lack compassion for the child of her womb? The clear answer there is no. Like that's unnatural for that to happen. But even if these forget, yet I will not forget you. Look, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are continually before me. This is what God says. I am not like humans who flee when times get hard. I will bring deliverance from defeat and honor from shame. You are engraven on my hands. You are written on my heart. I will not forget you. And this is seen and evidenced most clearly in the fact that our cries of how long and the cries of the saints of how long down through the centuries were answered through the cries of a baby boy. God made flesh. The answer to David's prayers for God to see, to show up, and to restore light to his eyes in the midst of darkness. They were all fulfilled and answered in Christ. Look at John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. God spoke through the face of the Son, Jesus. The Word was with God. The Word was God. In him was life. And what was that life? It was the light of men, the brightness. It shines in the darkness. And the darkness did not overcome it. That word became flesh and dwelt among us. God does not leave us in our suffering. Everything that we have felt, Jesus felt. The cries that David were expressing, the reality that he felt, Jesus felt. We see that in the garden where he sweats great drops of blood. Medically, this is something that typically only happens under extreme anxiety or stress. Like, this was the full weight of the world on his shoulders. He knows exactly what he's about to walk into. He knows exactly what he's about to face. But because of his hesed, his covenant everlasting love, he sets his face like a flint and he surrenders. And what does he say? Not my will, but yours be done. Willingly, he enters into death on our behalf. He is the one who allowed the enemy to dominate him, to humiliate him, to plunder him as the crowd strips him naked and then mocks him and spits on him and slanders him. He saved others, but he can't even save himself. But for covenant love, he willingly walks into that. He fully trusts his Father's love. As on the cross, he prays, into your hands, I give you my spirit. It is yours, I am letting go. And he does actually sleep, a real death. Physically died, and he's laid and buried in a borrowed tomb, and the enemy rejoices as he triumphs over him. The powers of darkness do their worst, and Jesus absorbs it all. The devils dance on his grave. And I guarantee you the followers of Jesus ask questions with much greater doubt than how long those nights. But those dark nights wouldn't last. Early on that third morning, the stone rolls away and the morning light floods the vision of the Messiah. Brightness is restored to his eyes. And the Father was revealed to be worthy of the trust of Jesus as he defeats death and darkness once and for all, raised by the power of the Spirit, Father, Son, and Spirit together, defeating all the enemies of darkness. It is finished. And so this is the invitation for us that no matter what we face, even in the midst of the darkest night, even when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death itself, death will not have the final word. For all who trust in the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, we are promised everlasting life. He said, I'm going to prepare a place for you, a place where sorrows and crying will be no more. And just as sure as Jesus came the first time, he will return again to finish the work. And so we live right now in the midst of this, in the midst of suffering. You might be experiencing the dark night of the soul, but joy will come in the morning. The resurrection of Jesus, it was just the first fruits. There is more to come in store. And you can trust in that. The enemy will be cast out of the kingdom forever and ever. You can be confident looking back to the cross and resurrection in God's hesed love for you. You are graven on his hands, written on his heart. You are his portion, and he will never forsake you. And by grace alone, when our hearts begin to believe this, it actually begins to change us, church. We can actually begin to be honest about how we really feel. Because the cross proves God's covenant love for us. He knows your worst thoughts. He knows your worst accusations before you even say them out loud, and still he went to the cross for you. So we don't have to fake it. We can be honest with him. He ain't going nowhere. We can shout in anger. We can cry in grief. We can beg and plead. How long? We can wrestle with our own doubts in his presence. We can lament that it seems the enemy has humiliated us. And because we know that our cries are not meaningless, because we know that the tears of saints are being stored in a bottle until the final day when God will answer every prayer, we can move from lament to clear request. We can ask God. We can demand, show up, act, move, see what's going on, and do something. We can even trust him enough to explore the motivations behind our prayers. And in the end, we can trust not in ourselves or our own goodness, but in the covenant love of God. And because of this, and I've actually seen it, our hearts can begin to sing refrains of joy in the midst of deep sorrow. I've seen it in many of you, as I know the things you're facing. And I know that, yes, I know sometimes your heart doesn't believe it, but when I get a glimpse of those moments when it does, it encourages my faith and my soul. And it's unexplainable. It's what Paul calls a peace that passes understanding. Try to explain it, good luck. Try to explain how it happens, good luck. But because the object of our faith is real, because the resurrection is actually real, it gives us a peace that passes understanding. On the journey of life, we begin to move from the child asking how much longer every 5 minutes to the toddler that's conked out in the back seat with some snacks still on her belly, drool running down her lips, knowing she's gonna make it home. Her parents are in control. She's just chilling till the final destination. And that's my prayer. I mean, that's what I need. Like, this last month has been just hard for me. Can't even share the details. It's like hard. I'm like, all right, God, you're gonna have to meet me here. And it's amazing how he does. This is my hope for us, that through the ups and downs of life, through the sorrows and the griefs, losses, the pain, we can actually begin to believe that God has generously and abundantly provided everything we need in Christ. And that in the end, when we stand in the new creation, gazing on his glory, and we join together in the final kingdom of God, we will see that our afflictions were simply a blip on the radar of eternity. And somehow, though, they work to bring about a greater glory beyond comparison that will never fade away. So not much longer, saints. Soon and very soon, our King will return.